Welcome to episode 337 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Frank Gasper, who served in the FBI for 25 years. In this episode, Frank Gasper reviews his investigation of Elizabeth Kolling for elder fraud. Kolling, once head of the trust department at the Dickinson North Dakota branch of the Bank of the West, had been appointed as the trustee for elderly bank clients who had no close relatives to help them manage their finances. Kolling took advantage of her position and stole money and mineral rights from her senior citizen clients' accounts. Frank began his career in the New York division, investigating organized crime as part of the squad that targeted the Bonanno family. Frank then transferred to the surveillance branch and from there to an undercover support unit before going to the White Plains Resident Agency, where he worked investigations involving mail fraud, bank fraud, and public corruption. During this same period, Frank also served as a TDY, temporary duty, assistant legal attaché, ALAT, in Baghdad, Iraq. Later in his FBI career, Frank accepted a transfer to the Bismarck, North Dakota Resident Agency out of the Minneapolis division. Early in this assignment, he investigated violent crime and public corruption matters that occurred on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, before specializing in white-collar crime, public corruption, and investigating sexual assault cases throughout the territory. In 2019, Frank was awarded the U.S. Attorney General's Award for Fraud Prevention for Operation Hard Copy, a series of investigations and prosecutions relating to the Jamaican lottery fraud telemarketing scam. His investigation resulted in shutting down a multi-million-dollar international fraud ring that targeted the elderly in the U.S. and Canada. Frank is currently the principal of Gasper Investigations, LLC, a private investigation firm specializing in complex litigation support, corporate fraud investigations, background checks, and resolving employee misconduct issues. I'm sure you'll enjoy this case review as much as I did. You have to wonder, what does a person say to themselves that makes it okay to take a senior citizen's life savings? In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team, where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn all about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. There are also links for where you can buy me a cup of coffee and discover my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Frank Gasper. Hi, Frank.
Hey, how you doing, Jerry?
I'm doing great. I'm real excited about this case because, as you know, and as everybody knows, that's what I did in the FBI. I did fraud and economic crime. And of course, the thing that really would get me upset and really gung-ho about a case is if it involved the elderly. I mean, that really got to me when somebody would try to take advantage of senior citizens.
I was the same way. I did a lot of elderly fraud cases, and it really upsets me when the most vulnerable people, the elderly or the very young, are victimized by these perpetrators.
All right. So on this particular case, where do you want to start?
Okay, the Elizabeth Kolling case, well catalyzed by the FBI as a bank embezzlement case, is in reality a story of a vice president of a small town bank using her position as the bank's vice president to prey on the most vulnerable of victims, the elderly and the infirmed. I arrived at the Bismarck RA with more than 14 years of investigative experience. The last 7 of those, I worked on a general white-collar crime squad in New York. At the time the Kolling case was opened and assigned to a new agent who had just recently graduated from new agents training. His name was Chris Trombley. Chris did a great job. The case began after the head of security for the Bank of the West, that's the bank that eventually took over the bank where Elizabeth Kolling was employed, contacted the FBI with something that the Bank of the West had uncovered. What had happened is approximately June of 2008, a relative of one of the eventual elderly victims, a woman named Mildred Polensky, contacted the Bank of the West concerning some withdrawals that relative had noticed had occurred from Mildred's trust account, which was held at the Bank of the West branch in Dickinson, North Dakota. Polensky had recently moved in with her daughter in Oregon, and the trust account was transferred there. Previously, Polensky had lived in Dickinson and had lived off the income of the trust account, which was established at the Community First Bank in 1994, where Elizabeth Kolling ran the trust department. Mildred had been a long-time resident of a long-term care facility in Dickinson, North Dakota, and Elizabeth Kolling, as the head of the trust department, was appointed the trustee of Polensky's trust. The reason why Elizabeth Kolling got that position, was appointed the trust, was that Mildred had no other relatives close to her in North Dakota who could serve as a trustee. The Bank of the West conducted an internal audit, and they've uncovered 4 trust accounts in which Kolling had served as a trustee, and which there was withdrawals that the Bank of the West determined were fraudulent. One of the other victims was a woman named Betty Reichert. I don't want to confuse our listeners. Elizabeth Kolling is also known as Betty Kolling, and most people call her Betty. But I'm trying to use Elizabeth here. But what happens is the Bank of the West's audit was not complete and reported to the FBI until sometime in 2009 after Betty Reichert had died. It was my initial role when I got to the Bismarck Resident Agency in 2010 to help Chris with his investigation, since I was the senior special agent in the Bismarck Resident Agency. Chris focused on where the money had gone and discovered much of the money was funneled to Elizabeth Kolling's older sister, a woman named Anne Loran, and her adopted son, Michael Loran. The U.S. Attorney's Office at the time, in early 2010, had decided to obtain restraining orders on various vehicles and toys that had been purchased for Michael Moran, such as a boat, a jet ski, and a classic car. There was a coordinated plan that Chris came up with to go out, conduct interviews, and serve restraining orders on the items that were in the name of Michael Moran. Soon after these restraining orders were served, Chris Trombley received a no-cost transfer to WFO to join his fiancée, who became his wife. When Chris transferred, the case was assigned to me. When Chris served those restraining orders, Chris actually interviewed Elizabeth Kolling while I was interviewing Michael Loran, and Chris got Kolling to admit making some of the fraudulent transfers the Bank of the West had discovered in Mildred Polensky's account. But many other aspects of the case had not been uncovered at the time.
Do you recall what her rationalization was? You said she admitted to some.
Not at the time that Chris interviewed her. She did eventually admit during a proffer session that her oldest sister, Anne Loran, had taken care of their elderly mother and hadn't had a job for a number of years. So Elizabeth Kolling was trying to help Anne Loran and her adopted son out by giving them the money from the proceeds of the fraud.
And I guess we're going to find out if that's true or not, or if indeed Elizabeth used some of that money for her own personal needs.
That's correct. I will get into that. When I took over the case, I learned that Elizabeth Kolling had obtained some mineral rights before different pieces of property in the counties of Montreal, the county of Dunn, the county of Stark, and Golden Valley in North Dakota. These 4 counties are located in the heart of the Bakken oil field, which was just beginning to develop in 2008 when Elizabeth Kolling got these mineral rights from Betty Reichert. That was just at the beginning of when fracking was invented, and fracking made these mineral rights very valuable. The mineral rights were originally part of the Betty Reichert Trust, of which Elizabeth Kolling was the trustee. Talk a little bit about mineral rights. When I was a kid, there was a show that was on television in New York. It was Beverly Hillbillies. And in the show, these people owned land and oil was coming up and they end up being millionaires and they moved to Beverly Hills. Well, that's basically what we have going on here.
Let me ask you to explain mineral rights. I'm thinking Texas or Oklahoma.
In the area where these mineral rights are, there's a lot of oil and gas. It's good that you mentioned Oklahoma and Texas. Those are some of the other states. Louisiana is the third state where you can own mineral rights and not own the surface rights, all the land above it.
I own this property. I have a house or a business on it. I would have assumed that you also own anything further in the ground, the mineral rights.
41 states, that's true. But in 9 states, that it isn't true. People have a house, can sell off the mineral rights and still own the surface rights. But if you own the mineral rights, you have the right to come in and develop those mineral rights. Now, you have to pay the person who has a surface right. If you're coming into their land, you have to pay them for the use of their surface land. That area you can no longer use because of the drilling rig and because of the road going in there. They have to pay you rent to do that. And that those surface right owners get paid rent, but they don't have any right to any of the oil or gas coming from the ground. One of the reasons this was done in the history of North Dakota, this was done because the state receives money in North Dakota. 6% of all the oil or gas that's extracted goes to the state. It's taxed. So it's revenue to the state. So that's why the state likes mineral rights. It encourages development and it's a funding mechanism for the state.
All right, I get it now. So the owner of the surface rights may not have the ability to develop the mineral rights. And so they sell off that to someone else who may be able to get that oil and gas out of the ground.
Yes, you have that. And in the case of Betty Riker's husband, he had been an attorney for a long time. And there was an oil boom in North Dakota in the 1950s. But the oil boom eventually went bust because the old drilling techniques, it wasn't worth extracting oil anymore. There became dry wells. But on some deals, people would sell off their mineral rights to raise a little money. Or in this case, I believe it was a way to pay him his fees. They didn't have money to pay him. So they paid in the mineral rights, which at that time weren't worth anything. Those mineral rights went into the trust. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, those rights didn't have a lot of value. It wasn't really to 2008 where oil started being developed out in these oil fields, and that's all because of fracking.
I got it.
After obtaining copies of the mineral right documents from the Bank of the West, I went to the county clerk offices of the 4 counties where the mineral rights were located. Using the grantee or grantor indexes, and it was something that I'd learned about them when I was in law school doing a property class, but I had never really used them before. But I understand the concept. I went to those counties, and it was an education to me. I was able to find the 4 transfer deeds that Elizabeth Kolling and her husband, Walter Kolling, had filed in these counties. I had copies of these transfer deeds, and each one of these transfer documents had a power of attorney filed along with the transfer deeds. These power of attorneys were filed authorizing the transfer of the mineral rights out of the Betty Riker Trust to Betty Riker personally. And that's important. By doing that, Betty Riker would then be able to sell them legally. If they're part of the trust, she can't sell them. Then there were some transfer deeds in which Betty Riker personally, at a much reduced rate, sold these rights to Elizabeth and Walter Kolling.
Surprise. Like I didn't see that coming.
Yeah. And of course, these transfer deeds also had a power of attorney attached. My examination of these power of attorneys that I got from the counties in their county clerk's office, the deeds revealed how calculating Elizabeth Kolling truly was. Kolling had filed in the county clerk, to say, for example, in Golden Valley, the date on one of these deeds was November 17th, 2004. And in the deed, Betty Riker transferred the mineral rights from her trust account to her personally. This deed was signed by Kolling as a trustee for the Betty Riker account. However, this transfer deed was not filed till July 17th, 2008. That's almost 4 years after the date on the deed. Then on October 21st, 2008, another transfer deed was filed, transferring the Golden Valley mineral rights from Betty Riker personally to Walter and Elizabeth Kolling. That October 21st, 2008 date is important. Betty Riker died on October 19th of 2008. Among the deeds was one dated, again, it was dated March 19th, 1995, and reportedly had Betty Riker appearing personally and appointing Elizabeth Kolling as her attorney in fact. However, I found a notary entry on the next page. The notary was from a woman named Dolores Donkey, and the stamp indicated her notary commission expired on January 25th, 2006, which seemed strange because 1995, 2006. That's 11 years. That seemed like a long time for it to expire. So I checked with the North Dakota Secretary of State's records, and it revealed that Doris Olansky's notary commission had run from January 6th of 1995 to January 6th of 2000, and from January 25th of 2000 to January 25th, 2006. So the notary stamp that was on the deed dated 3/1995 could not have been for that deed. Dolores Dunchey, and I probably pronouncing it wrong, is Dutchuk. I never got to interview Dolores. Dolores, conveniently for Elizabeth Kolling, had died in December of 2003. So that was something I discovered. And then I started looking at these mineral rights, and something didn't strike me about these power of attorney. Something was wrong about them. So I went in and I started investigating all four of the mineral rights that reportedly were sold by Betty Riker personally to the Kollings, which happened to be all dated October 3rd, 2008. And Riker, as I told you earlier, she was a resident in a nursing home facility in Dickinson and died at that facility on October 19, 2008. All these deeds were notarized by a person named Kyle Klein, who was a fellow employee of Kolling at the Community Trust Bank, which later became the Bank of the West. I went to interview Kyle. During the interview, he admitted he notarized the deeds Elizabeth Kolling had brought to him. During questioning, I pointed out that Betty Riker had died on October 19, 2008, and it seemed a little too convenient, and asked to see Kyle's logbook. When Kyle went to get his logbook, he admitted to me that Elizabeth Kolling had come to him on October 20th, 2008, and asked him to notarize the transfer deeds, but to use the date of October 3rd, 2008, backdating those deeds. That's a crime in itself. Notaries cannot do that. The whole idea of the notary is that the date on the document is the date that's signed. Kyle told me he agreed to backdate the deeds, but would not do so unless Walter Kolling also appeared in front of him. But at the time, it was just Elizabeth and Kyle. And Kyle said, if I'm going to backdate these things, I want Walter here too. So Elizabeth Kolling went out and contacted her husband, and her husband came in.
All right, but shouldn't Betty Reichert have been in front of him to sign that document also? I know she couldn't because she was dead, but but technically they're all signing this transfer document.
They are, but Elizabeth Kolling had a power of attorney for Betty Riker. And with that power of attorney, she legally is allowed to sign Betty Riker's name. However, legally, power of attorneys end or terminate upon the death of the grantor or the person who's granting this power of attorney. Thus, since Betty Riker had died on the 19th of October, on the 20th of October, that power of attorney was worthless. It absolved. Legally, it was not binding. It was not worth the paper it was written on.
Well, let me ask you a question about Kyle. I mean, he had to be suspicious. Did he believe that something illegal was happening and he went ahead with it? Did he get something for cooperating?
Kyle told me, and I believe him, that he knew that the power of attorneys had expired, but Kolling, she had been a long-term employee. Kyle kind of looked up to her. She was the aunt he didn't have. Kolling's part of her genius, her evil genius, was she befriended everybody. She was everybody's friends with the staff of the bank. She had been head of the trust department for so long. She is a person who got you the birthday card on your birthday or remembered your birthday. She was that person, the friendly person. She used her relationship with Kyle. She got Kyle to commit a crime when he backdated those documents. That's a state crime. Thus, the Kollings had submitted fraudulent transfer deeds to obtain the 4 mineral right parcels. I'm going to explain a little bit how these mineral rights work. There are 9 states in the country in which mineral rights can be sold separate from surface rights. North Dakota happens to be one of those 9 states. Hey, I grew up in Queens, New York, and this was foreign to me. In New York, you own a piece of property, you own everything that goes down to the center of the earth. Well, in these other states, that isn't true. So after acquiring the mineral rights, the Collings contacted a landman to sell the options for development of the mineral and gas rights on those 4 sites. One of those parcels was located in Stark County in North Dakota, and an option to develop was made to the Kolling as the attorney of fact for Betty Riker in April of 2008, and that sold for over $7,000. Elizabeth Kolling and Walter Kolling knew well before July 2008 that these mineral rights were worth a large amount of money. And I'm going to explain a little bit what the option means. The option pays the rights owner money to hold the site for future drilling. And then if and when drilling occurs, the mineral rights owner then gets a percentage of the oil and gas that's collected minus any cost for the drilling incurred by that company. So that's where the Beverly Hillbillies come in. That's where the real money is when they drill on your site. I talked to earlier, I want to explain a little bit about Betty Riker. And this is an unusual case for me. Most of the time as an agent, you go out and you meet the victims in your cases, or you meet with their families. While I spoke to the representatives of the Bank of the West, I did not meet any of the elderly victims who were the true victims of Elizabeth Kolling and her family. By the time the FBI got the case and it was opened by Chris Trombley, Betty Riker had been dead a year or more. But with the manipulations I found that Elizabeth Kolling was doing with the Betty Riker Trust and the power of attorneys, I thought it was my job, almost my calling, to go out and find out more information about Betty Riker. Who was she? Who was the person who had been victimized like this? So I learned that Betty Riker was not originally from Dickinson, but had lived there most of her adult life. She had married a successful lawyer in Dickinson, but the couple had no children. Dickinson is a small town in North Dakota, and at the time, around 2000, had about 15,000 residents. It has grown since then. It's almost doubled in size, but that's because of the oil boom. Betty's husband died in 1974. His death really hit Betty hard. After his death, Betty became almost a recluse. She would wear a large amount of white makeup around her face. Around town, she was known as the Ghost Lady. Betty also had a long-time friendship with a famous actress, a woman named Dorothy Stickney, who eventually became a Broadway movie star who had been born and raised in Dickinson. Back in the 30s, or 40s, and 50s, when people wrote letters, and Betty had a long-time pen pal relationship with Miss Stickney. And Miss Stickney, like Betty, had died without children or any close relatives. And I knew that Betty had been in a nursing facility, so I went to that nursing facility where Betty had spent her last years. And I also spoke with the Stark County Social Services. At the nursing home, I learned Betty had only a few friends. But what really stuck in my mind, though, was in 2005, Betty Riker's trust and nursing home insurance ran out. The whole idea of this trust was to take care of her. Her husband had thought about it. She had nursing home insurance, but had run out. So Betty ended up penniless. To this day, it's hard for me not to tear up. One of the aides told me a story, but near the end of Betty's life, her feet had swollen up, and it was hard for Betty to wear her shoes. Since Betty did not have any money, she didn't have money to buy a new pair of shoes, the nursing attendants were forced to cut toes out of Betty's shoes so she could wear them. The attendant told me that Betty also complained that most of her jewelry had disappeared. This was a woman that had lived most of her adult life as a middle-class person, and now she was a ward of the state of North Dakota. And the Stark County Social Service Agency confirmed this to me.
How much do you think she was worth before Elizabeth Kolling got a hold of her finances?
I don't have exact figure, and I'll go on later why. It has to do with banks and how they keep records. But I believe that when Betty Riker's husband died in the early 70s, that they had over $1 million, which in 1970 dollars, that's a lot of money. I would guess at roughly $3 to $4 million, if not more. So I wanted to find out about these missing items. I thought that was important. Try to do some justice for Betty Riker. I was able to find 2 long-term friends of Betty Riker. During those interviews, I learned about the letters that Betty had exchanged with Dorothy Stickney. And I was also told about how Betty had owned many valuable pieces of jewelry. And there was one ring in particular that Betty would speak about and was proud of. And I also had learned that she had told one of the nursing attendants about this ring. And I was also told about an original oil painting of a cowboy, which was done by a famous Western artist. I don't recall the person's name now, which was missing. And these friends told me about it. It was in her living room. It was a conversation piece. The friends also told me how Elizabeth Kolling had cleaned Betty's house out when Betty went to the nursing home, and that's when these items went missing. While I was unable to find the ring, I might have found it doing a search, but I couldn't be certain. Anyway, I was able to find the painting. The painting was located in Jamestown, North Dakota, which is approximately 200 miles east of Dickinson, at the National Buffalo Museum. The painting was hanging on the wall. The museum had received that painting from Walter Kolling, who had signed a consignment agreement with the museum. I believe the painting the price was either $3,000 to $5,000, and Walter Kolling was to receive most of the proceeds from the sale of the painting. The shop got to keep some of those proceeds. Walter Kolling is Elizabeth Kolling's husband, married for a number of years. After learning of the fraudulent sales of the mineral rights of Walter and Elizabeth Kolling, I went to interview Walter Kolling. That interview took place in January 2011. And during the interview, Walter claimed that he and his wife had purchased the mineral rights on October 3rd, 2008, just 16 days before Betty Riker's death, and he provided me a check paying Betty Riker for the rights. That check was for a low amount, and I believe it was somewhere around $1,100. I'm going off memory, I could be wrong, but it was for a much lower amount than what the rights were really worth.
And do you know how much the rights were worth?
I do not have an exact figure, but they were worth in hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Well, we can assume that also because we know just the option itself, they got $7,000 for it.
Yes, and that was early on. Those rights, where they were and where they're located, they're at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. If you drive out in western North Dakota, you will see literally thousands of oil wells out there. And this is right in the center of this. What was funny about the check is that it showed it was deposited on October 24th, 2008, and was signed by Elizabeth Kolling as attorney-in-fact for Betty Riker. Obviously, as I told you earlier, Betty Riker had died on October 19th. Walter Kolling verified during this interview that he and his wife had received lease payments from different oil companies in 2010. Because of the information that Walter Kolling had provided me during the interview, I was able to gather enough evidence to show probable cause to obtain a search warrant to search the Kolling's residence in Dickinson. When you obtain a search warrant, you have to have probable cause a crime has been committed, and there's evidence of that crime in that location. So I was able to do that. I then conducted a search of the Kolling residence. And during the search, there was a couple items that were really disturbing to me that we found. The first of the items was a jar that contained between 25 and 30 old gold women wedding rings. And one thing I've learned in life, women do not give up their wedding rings. Especially older people, they cherish that. And the second thing was even more disturbing. There was literally a jar containing a large number of gold teeth.
Yeah, that is weird.
The reason why it really disturbed them was we were searching for documents, so we were looking at papers. One of the papers we turned up was Elizabeth Kolling's original birth certificate. That birth certificate was for a German citizen issued in Poland in 1943. It was in German and was for a German citizen. Later, I learned during Elizabeth Kolling's proffer that she claimed her parents were Russian Germans who'd been saved from Stalin in the Russian army by the German army during World War II. However, the birth certificate appeared to be issued to the family of a German official stationed in Poland. In fairness to Elizabeth Kolling, her parents came to North Dakota in 1948 or so. I believe it was 1948. It could have been a year earlier or a year later, but I believe it was 48. You're not going to tell your daughter that you're a German official in Poland in 1943. So they might have told Elizabeth what they told the immigration officials in order to come to America. If people know the history, if you were a Nazi official, you were not permitted to immigrate to America in the 40s. But at the time, Elizabeth Kolling, she was a baby in Poland. She was a young child when she came to America, and she would have known the truth one way or the other concerning her parents' activities during World War II. The story she told during the proffer was that she was been told by German Russians that her mother was digging foxholes and that she actually lost a child because of the activity of digging the foxholes. True or not, but having gold teeth, having gold wedding rings and having a German birth certificate in Poland in 1943 brought on the idea of the Holocaust and what horrible crimes that occurred in that period of time back in Poland.
And so the thought is that these were something that her father, who may have been involved in concentration camps, collected and brought over to the U.S. with him.
Yes, either concentration camps or somehow he was a German civil official in Poland who had access to valuables that prisoners would give up.
That is so disturbing. And did you ask her about it? Do you know if she was aware of these items and her birth certificate? And had she ever explored the possibility?
I did not ask her about that during the proffer, and I'll talk about the proffer in a little bit, how it went, and the reason why I didn't get into that at the proffer. But I did try to do some research on ancestry, and I didn't get anywhere on it. Elizabeth Kolling, she had an older sister named Anne Loran, who was an unmarried sister. And I think I spoke a little bit. Anne had cared for their mother before she died. And Anne had a son, Michael Loran, I mentioned earlier, who Anne had adopted as an infant. It wasn't completely clear, but it appears that Michael Loran may have been a child of a relative of Anne and Elizabeth, and she raised Michael as her own for that relative. Anne lived in a house in Richardson, North Dakota. It's about 20 minutes from Elizabeth. Anne was essential, absolutely essential to the scheme. Elizabeth Kolling would cause electronic checks to be sent to a Charles Schwab account and had an account number written on them. The name of the account holder was not written on the checks, and that was done on purpose. So people might know that Anne Loran and Elizabeth Kolling were sisters. It was later determined that the Charles Schwab account was opened and was in the name of Anne Loran. Anne lived on much of the money. She hadn't had a job since she worked at the Five and Dime, which closed in the early 1980s. So she lived on the money, and also the money was wasted to buy expensive toys for Michael. He had a classic car, he had a speedboat, he had a jet ski, he had a snowmobile. During a proffer session, Elizabeth Kolling basically gave the excuse that she stole the money to help Anne out. However, during that proffer, she didn't bring up how she justified stealing the mineral rights.
Were you able to do a financial analysis and determine how much money the sister received?
It was somewhere around $550,000 that we definitely know that she received. The total amount lost was over $700,000.
And it sounds like the sister, although she may have, quote unquote, needed the money to live on, she spent a lot of that buying these expensive toys for her son.
Exactly. It eventually came to the point where Anne Loran had to be interviewed. Anne initially denied knowledge or involvement in the scheme. And Jerry, a good thing of conducting financial investigations is that everything is on paper. So after showing Anne some checks, account documents, some other documents we had, she began to confess her role in the scheme. And it's funny, we were in her kitchen at the time. Right after Anne started to confess, a Stark County deputy sheriff came to the door and started coming into the residence while we're in the back in the kitchen. One of the best things about working in the Bismarck RA, I got to work with some great people. Since we were a small RA, most of the time you end up having to work by yourself doing interviews. I had a kind of a rule where if I'm going to interview somebody of the opposite sex, or it's a subject interview, I take another agent with me. And luckily, I got to work with a guy named Chad Coulter, and Chad came with me. Chad had transferred to the RA. He had been seasoned agent. He had worked in Arkansas as a cop prior to coming to the FBI. He then became an agent. He was back in Arkansas, and then he transferred to the Bismarck RA. And I tell you what, worked with some great agents, and Chad was one of them. So during the interview, when this Stark County deputy started coming in, Chad got up and immediately asked the deputy to step outside so he could speak. Chad identified himself as the FBI agent and why we were there. The deputy then tells Chad and I had to leave. The deputy happened to live up the block, and it's a very, very small town, Richardson, North Dakota. I would imagine there's probably 1,000 residents in Richardson. Deputy saw her car outside. Initially, he thought he was looking out for the welfare of Anne, so that's why he came there. But the deputy was a young guy, not very experienced, and he didn't understand the role between federal and state officers. He thought he was in charge of the scene. Chad got him outside, calmed him down. Chad tells me later on, the deputy goes, "Hey, are you armed?" And Chad goes, "Yes, I'm armed." And Frank, he's armed too, We're FBI agents. He goes, and the deputy tells Chad, I would feel better if you guys gave me your weapons.
What?
Absolutely sure. He asked us to surrender. He asked Chad to surrender his firearm. Obviously, we're FBI agents, authorized to carry throughout the country, and we're not going to comply with the deputy's request. Eventually, Chad, being a much better diplomat than I would have been, Chad was able to get the deputy to calm down, to understand. The deputy said, I just want to make sure Ann's okay. So the deputy steps inside, spoke to Ann, made sure she was okay, and then he left. But the damage was done. The deputy's interruption caused Ann to stop cooperating in the interview, and the interview ended. So we didn't get as much as we could have from Ann. Obviously, we had enough evidence that Ann was part of the conspiracy. And eventually, the U.S. Attorney's Office indicted Ann in the scheme and the conspiracy. You might remember the O.J. Simpson car chase, and I think it was 1994. Well, this is my one and only car chase. Ann got indicted. She was an elderly lady. I tried to call on the telephone, to tell her, hey, come to Bismarck to surrender yourself. She wouldn't answer the phone. It came up FBI Bismarck. So eventually, Chad and we went down to Richardson to arrest Ann. We parked in front of her house, go up to the door. We ring the doorbell. We knock on the door. Hey, Ann, it's Frank Gasper, the FBI. Can you let us in? We're here to arrest you. And Ann doesn't come to the door. We think Ann's in the house, but she doesn't come to the door. So Chad and I would go back outside. We sit in the car. We sit there over an hour. Ann doesn't come. And then I realized I'd heard that she had volunteered at the local nursing home, which was a couple blocks away. So we drove up to the nursing home. We go in the nursing home and then we're told, nah, Ann's not volunteering today. So we immediately got back in our car. We weren't gone more than, I'd say, 7 or 8 minutes, maybe less. As we're driving back to Ann's house, we see Ann pulling out of her garage and then driving up the block towards us in the opposite direction. So we try to flag Ann down. She ignores us. We pop a U-turn, turn on our lights and siren. Chad's driving. I'm in the passenger seat, and we bumper lock Ann, lights and siren, trying to get her to pull over. Ann goes up the end of the street. She makes a left. The thing about it, she's not driving more than 15 miles an hour. She was really driving slow. We go down probably another half mile or so, and she makes another left. Luckily, Richardson, North Dakota, well, it's a small town that has extremely wide streets, and there's not a lot of cars parked in the streets. So Chad eventually pulls alongside of Ann. I roll down my window. Ann rolled down her window, but we're still moving. She's not stopping. Ann goes, who are you? I say, Ann, I'm Frank Gasper with the FBI. Literally out the window, I display my credentials, say, Ann, remember I was at your house? She goes, yeah, I remember. She goes, what do you want? You're under arrest, Ann. And she goes, for what? You helped steal $1 million. That's for what? You'd steal $1 million and eventually the FBI is going to come get you. Go back to your house, park your car, keep your garage door open, get in a car. We're going to drive it from Richardson to Bismarck, which is about an hour away. So we drive up to the courthouse and Ann gets arraigned. I want to emphasize here, I had this case. Dickinson's a small town. It eventually gets out that the FBI is investigating Elizabeth Kolling, the former vice president of the trust department, the local bank, for stealing from the trust that Elizabeth had supervised. Well, a family member from an individual who had a trust at the bank where Elizabeth worked in the late 1980s into early 1990s called me. The bank originally called the First National Bank of Dickinson. Then it got taken over. It was called Community First Bank. The person told me, we told the bank there was something wrong with their trust account, with their mom's trust account. And the bank ignored it. Oh, no, Elizabeth, she's good to go. No. So they didn't do anything. So the family wrote the governor of North Dakota, contacted the governor's office trying to investigate to find out what's going on with the trust account. This family didn't have any bank records, or almost no bank records at all. But they did have a copy of the letter, and I was able to contact the governor's office, but no investigation was commenced by the state. So I wasn't really able to help the family. In case people don't realize, most banks only keep records for 7 years. But after 7 years, the banks destroy the records. The rationale behind that was, there's some self-interest involved. For anything older than 7 years, it's not going to help the bank at all. If there's a mistake made in the bank's favor, they've already accounted for that loss in financial statements years earlier. So the only thing that really could happen on something that's older than 7 years is to hurt the bank, that someone has a claim against the bank. And that would hurt their present day bottom line. Banks realize by getting rid of the records, they're ensuring that they're not going to have any problems later on. So Elizabeth Kolling, she knew when this whole thing went down in 2008 that the banks wouldn't have records from the year 2000 and before.
And when did she start working as a vice president for trust accounts?
She worked her way up. Originally, she was just a regular teller at the bank. She got employed by the trust department within a year or two. That was around 76 to 77. By the late 1980s, she became the head of the trust department, and eventually she becomes a vice president.
So there could have been as many as 20 to 25 years that she was dipping into the trust accounts of her elderly customers.
We'll never know. We will never know. And that's one of the sad parts about it. And remember, Elizabeth Kolling had stated her justification was, hey, I had to help out my sister who was helping out elderly mother. Well, her sister hadn't had a job since the early 1980s. Jerry, you know this. Most of the time when someone takes a plea or a cooperation agreement, we have a proffer session. Elizabeth Kolling actually was never indicted. We charged her with an information. Elizabeth Kolling hired famous defense attorneys in the state of North Dakota, an older guy named Irv Novland. He was probably the highest paid defense attorney in the state at the time. During our proffer session, she had the discovery, all our documents. We turned it all over to defense. So she had everything. She had my affidavit. So she knew the case that we had. She didn't provide any information that wasn't already used in a search warrant affidavit or any of the other affidavits. In the proffer session, I knew where it was going. I could see what Irv Novland was setting up here. Hey, this is a one-off, and Elizabeth's really a good person. So after I said, you know what, let me go take a look in Elizabeth Kolling's background before we get the report done by the probation department. How detailed it is, most of it's going to be what Elizabeth tells him. So I went back and I wanted to see, where did she work before she worked at the bank? Because she started in 75. So I eventually found some people, and they told me she worked at the Woolworths with her at the time. And I had known that Ann also worked at the Woolworths at the same time. And I called this person up. I asked the person about Elizabeth Kolling. The Woolworths, understand, it literally was across the street from the bank. So this co-worker told me what had happened and why Elizabeth Kolling was fired. At the time, Woolworth had a vendor that rented out space and one of the counters. Sales for that vendor was kept separate from the other money. This is in the 70s, and cash was king at that time. Very little use of credit cards, and so there was a lot of cash. There was one worker who was responsible for this vendor and accounting for the money. Well, that worker, father, had suffered a heart attack. I believe it was on a Thursday night, and had to leave. Elizabeth Kolling was assigned to take over. And so on the Saturday, Elizabeth Kolling made sure to tell the supervisors, you know, it's Saturday. We have to account for the money in the safe. It's done on a weekly basis. They go in, they open the safe, and wouldn't you know, it was supposed to be approximately $4,600 to $4,800 in the safe. It's missing. Kolling manipulated the management into thinking that the co-worker who had left to go help out her father had stolen the money. To my surprise, I learned that the Woolworth Corporation in the 1970s actually brought in an outside polygrapher to conduct interviews. Eventually, it comes to the point where they polygraph Elizabeth Kolling. Well, guess what? Elizabeth Kolling, doing her polygraph examination and interview, admits to stealing the money.
Wow.
And this is $4,800, $1975. I'm going to guess that's probably worth $20,000 or $25,000 now, maybe more.
And this is the job that she had before she started working at the bank.
That's correct. She gives back somewhere between $2,800 and $3,000 of the money and claims that, hey, I spent the rest of the money. So Woolworths fired Elizabeth Kolling, but they didn't contact law enforcement. So she wasn't prosecuted. Well, this woman told me, this coworker, the day after Elizabeth Kolling was fired, she goes across the street and goes into the First National Bank of Dickinson and asks for a job. And they hire her. No one at the bank knew that Elizabeth Kolling stole the money.
You would think that with it being such a small town, that the rumor mill would have made its way across the street.
All the employees in this case were all women. And I think there was a sense of they didn't want to hurt Elizabeth Kolling. Remember, that's her personality. And she had ingratiated herself with all those people. That's how good she was. The Bank of the West, they didn't realize when they purchased Community First Bank that this Elizabeth Kolling was doing what she did with the Mildred Polensky Trust and the other accounts. But had the opportunity to stop it, they acquired it in November 2004. That same month, Elizabeth Kolling was doing the scheme where she had the electronic check made out to Charles Schwab, had the account number on it. That check went to the headquarters of, at that time, Community First Bank, which became the Bank of the West at that time. It was literally that month they were changing over. For the first time, that transfer was denied. And the reason listed, it said not used for the intended purpose. That's what it says. They denied it. But nobody at the bank followed up and say, why was Elizabeth Kolling attempting to do this in the first place? And they didn't bother to check, had she done this in the past? They let it go. And, the bank could have found it would have been 4 years earlier. And maybe Betty Riker wouldn't have died penniless with shoes that had to have the toes cut out.
That really visualizes the harm Elizabeth Kolling did to her victims. Do we have an idea of how many accounts that she stole money from?
We know of 4 accounts she did it to. One of the other victims was an old farmer, never married, had a trust account. Another was an older woman who had a trust account. I wasn't able to interview her. And the old farmer, he was incapacitated. He was not able to be interviewed at all.
Please tell me that she went to prison.
She did.
Oh, wow. I just knew you were going to say that because it was her first offense and because of her age and charm that she didn't. But okay, what did she get?
She ended up getting 41 months, paid restitution. That tells me that she had stolen a whole lot more money before she got caught. But she literally paid all the money back. Walter Kolling, he only got 8 months of home confinement. And Anne Loran ends up getting probation. I think part of the reason why Elizabeth ended up getting some jail time was because of the fact that we found that she had stolen before. This wasn't her first rodeo. Anyway, so that's what happened here. Michael Loran was never charged. I don't think he actually realized that his Aunt Elizabeth was stealing the money from the bank. But everybody else did end up with a conviction, and Elizabeth ended up doing 41 months.
That's a good ending. That's a very good ending. Well, I want to thank you, Frank, for presenting this case review and sharing your investigation of Elizabeth Kolling and how she took advantage of her elderly clients. We're at the point of the episode where I ask my standard question. When and why did you join the FBI?
I joined the FBI in December of 1995. Prior to that, I was an assistant district attorney in the county of Queens. I have a law license. I still maintain a law license. And prior to that, I was a Marine Corps officer. I was an infantry officer, got off after duty, went to law school, got out of law school, went to the Gulf War, came back, got the job at the DA's office. I went in the DA's office. I was working narcotics trials, buy and bust, and I wanted to do something different. I always wanted to make a difference in life. I'm a kid who watched a lot of old television shows in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I believe in the good guys. Do something good for society. And I always felt that way. That's why I joined the Marine Corps. And I thought that the FBI, I could make a difference. I like being an assistant district attorney, but I like doing investigations. I like solving things. And that's why I loved being an FBI agent. I did it for over 25 years. I don't feel I had a job the whole time with the FBI. That's how much I loved it. It wasn't a job to me. I don't know if it's a calling, whatever. It was not a job to me. I'd still be an FBI agent today. They didn't have mandatory retirement. I was able to get 3 years. Mandatory retirement is 57. You can get yearly waivers. It has to be signed off for by the director. You apply for it and they approve it or not approve it. I was able to get 3 waivers up to the age of 60. But the law states you cannot be 60 and be an FBI agent or any 1811. So I literally left the day before my birthday. And my wife hates when I say this, but I literally feel like I was fired, but I have a lifetime severance.
So you were one of those people that they had to actually push and pull out the door when your time was up.
I worked to 10:30 the night before my birthday. It was a Sunday night. And the only reason why I didn't leave at 12 was because I had a support person came in to take my gun and badge and credentials and everything else. And I told her I was going to work late. So she came in and she was waiting for me to finish up and I'd walk out the door.
Wow, Frank, that's what you call dedication. So you're retired. What are you doing now?
As soon as I retired, I opened Gasper Investigations. It's a private investigative firm. I'm licensed in New York, Minnesota, Illinois, and North Dakota. I team with former FBI agents throughout the country, but I like to specialize in financial investigations, fraud, employee malfeasance, but I worked on a number of things. I have done some criminal work, a couple Indian tribes I've done some work for. I've done some work for some corporations. I probably turn down more work than I take. I don't do divorce cases. I don't do that. When people call me, hey, I think my spouse is cheating on me, I tell them, don't waste your money on me. Go get an attorney. The relationship is over. You've lost that trust. I'm not here to take your money. I didn't think it'd be as rewarding as it has, but I love what I did in the FBI. If I could, I'd be an agent today.
That says a lot. I'd like to give my guest the last word. So, what would you like to say?
I want to recognize my family, which I don't think I give enough credit to. My wife, Sabina, love her dearly, and my 4 great children, John, who we call Jack, Rose, Jane, and Luke. 3 of those 4 attended or are finishing the Naval Academy. I'm unbelievably proud of each and every one of them. I love those children dearly. I want to send a shout out to my oldest son, Jack. He's an F-18 pilot, currently deployed to the Middle East aboard the Abraham Lincoln. Jack, thinking about you and all your shipmates. Stay safe, buddy. Love you.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Frank Gasper and links to articles about how Elizabeth Kolling defrauded her elderly clients and stole from their trust accounts and sold off their mineral rights. There's also a link to the FBI website where you can learn more about elder fraud. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.